think time touches everything equally. It does not. The light entering your eyes now has crossed distance without laying down a second along its path. You believe every journey must be felt as duration by whatever makes it. Physics says the signal revealing the world to you does not age between emission and arrival. Not slowly. Not almost not at all. None. And if the universe depends on interactions carried by something that does not move through time the way you do, then the present you trust is less fundamental, less stable, and less real than it feels today. A photon leaves a star. That sentence sounds simple. It sounds like a beginning. Then you imagine the rest. A long crossing, a delayed arrival. You imagine time stretched between those events. You imagine the photon spending that time in transit. Because your life is built that way. You change by sequence. You remember by sequence. You wait by sequence. So when something travels, you assume it must pass through duration the way you do. You believe distance guarantees time. Physics says distance alone guarantees nothing. Relativity does not begin with your intuition of motion. It begins with structure. Not space alone, not time alone. Spacetime. And inside that structure, the deepest quantity is the interval between events. That interval survives when observers disagree about measurements. They can disagree about duration. They can disagree about length. They can disagree about simultaneity. But they do not escape the geometry underneath. And light occupies the sharpest boundary in that geometry. Its path is not just fast. Its path is lightlike. Along a light-like path, the proper time is zero. Not nearly zero. Not effectively zero. Zero. You believe every real journey must contain elapsed time. Physics says the signal making the visible world possible lays down none along its path. That does not mean the journey disappears for you. From Earth, light from the sun takes about 8 minutes to arrive. From distant galaxies, it can take millions or billions of years. Those durations are real within the coordinates of observers made of matter, clocks, motion, and history. But the structure underneath says something else. Along the path of the light itself, no proper time accumulates. That is where the fracture opens. Because the world you trust is built from both statements. You live in measured delay. You see through ageless signals. And the mind resists that combination. It wants one clean story. Either light really takes time, or it really does not. But relativity does not permit that comfort. The long travel belongs to a frame. Zero proper time belongs to invariant structure. You do not get to keep only one. People usually reach for a shortcut. They say, from the photon's perspective, the trip is instant. It sounds right. It almost feels inevitable. But that sentence goes too far. A photon does not have a valid rest frame in special relativity. You cannot stand still beside light and describe the universe from there. So the physics must stay precise. Established physics. The proper time along a light-like path is zero. Interpretive shorthand. The trip is instantaneous for the photon. Those are not identical statements. If you blur them together, the mechanism loses its edge. The universe is visible to you through interactions carried by something that does not accumulate time the way you do. You believe sight gives you presence. Physics says sight gives you contact through a structure that breaks your idea of time. So the question is no longer just about light. The question is why your present feels continuous if the signals composing it do not share your kind of temporal passage. That is the paradox still standing. The room appears stable. The wall appears present. The star appears past. Relativity says these appearances are local arrangements inside a deeper geometry that does not preserve the human version of now. Maybe time is not the medium everything moves through equally. Maybe it is the name you give to what certain paths through space-time are able to keep. You can feel the old model trying to survive. It says this is only language, a trick. Light still leaves. Light still travels. Light still arrives. So beneath the equations, it must pass through time the way everything else does. That is intuition repairing itself. Because once one real thing moves without accumulating time, your picture of motion begins to fail. You were taught that motion happens in time. A runner crosses a field. A train crosses a country. A signal crosses space. But always the same stage. Time is assumed first. Motion is placed inside it. Relativity reverses that order. Time is not the universal container. It is part of the structure being measured. Motion helps determine what time can be measured along a path. That is where intuition begins to slip. Because your body teaches you something false by teaching you something useful. At ordinary speeds, the false model works. You leave a room. You walk down a street. You wait 10 seconds. Nothing there forces you to question the assumption. Time appears shared. Duration appears universal. Sequence appears absolute. So the mind promotes convenience into reality. You believe what works locally must also be true fundamentally. Physics says local usefulness is not deep structure. Relativity feels offensive. It does not merely adjust measurements. It accuses intuition of mistaking approximation for reality. And light is where that accusation becomes impossible to ignore. If light were just another moving object, only faster, the old model could survive. Time would remain the same. Light would cover more distance per second. But nature does not allow that. The speed of light is not just a high speed inside a world of time. It helps define the structure of space-time. That is why every observer must measure the same value for it. And once that is true, space and time cannot stay independent. They flex together. Lengths contract, durations dilate, simultaneity breaks. These are not side effects. They preserve deeper structure. The old intuition tries one more defense. It says, clocks may disagree, but surely one real time still exists underneath, a hidden flow. That fallback fails too. Relativity does not describe observers sampling one hidden river differently. It describes a world where no such river is required. What exists instead is a network of events with geometric relations between them. Some paths through that network accumulate proper time. Light-like paths do not. That is not a measurement error, it is the structure. And now the collapse becomes personal. Because your identity depends on continuity. You trust yourself as persistent because one moment seems to pass into the next. You wake, you think, you remember yesterday, you anticipate tomorrow. Your life feels like proof that reality unfolds that way. But it proves only this: a human organism traces a time-like path and accumulates proper time. That is enough to generate sequence. It is not enough to make sequence universal. You believe continuity of experience reveals continuity in reality. Physics says continuity of experience may reveal only the kind of path you occupy. Now the room begins to change. The far wall behind Einstein does not bend like fiction. It drifts out of alignment. The ceiling line stays straight, but the depth beneath it feels less certain. That is the correct instability. Relativity does not make the world unreal. It makes geometry conditional. And once geometry becomes conditional, your fallback language weakens. Words like before, after, now, at the same time begin to depend on motion and causal relation. You can still use them. You cannot use them absolutely. This matters because your picture of light depends on absolute language. You say the photon is still traveling. Still, compared to what? You say it has not arrived yet. Yet, for which slicing of spacetime? You say the trip is taking time. Measured where? Along which path? The old model speaks confidently because it hides its assumptions. Relativity removes that shelter. It forces every statement to declare its structure: frame, interval, world line, causal limit. Once those enter, the naive picture begins to starve. And at the center of that collapse is one cold fact. The visible world reaches you through signals that do not inhabit time the way you do. That does not make your world false. It makes your intuition provincial, deeply incomplete. You can still say the sunlight took 8 minutes. You can still say a star is far away. You can still say events unfold, but you can no longer mean those sentences with your old certainty. So the old picture has failed. Now something must replace it. Not a metaphor, not a feeling, a structure. Relativity does not leave you with confusion as the final answer. It leaves you with geometry. That word sounds abstract, but geometry here means something precise. It means the relations that remain true when perspective changes. Physical perspective, state of motion, position in space-time. The reason your intuition broke is that you were trying to build reality from local sequence. The replacement begins when you build it from invariant structure instead. Start with events, not objects, not stories, events. A flash at a star, a strike on a detector, a pulse leaving a screen, a signal arriving at your eye. Physics does not begin by asking how they feel. It begins by asking how they are related. Some event pairs can be connected by slower than light processes. Those are time-like. Some can be connected only at the limiting speed. Those are light-like. Some cannot influence each other at all. Those are space-like. That is more solid than intuition ever was. It asks what structure permits. And light sits exactly on the boundary that makes the system legible. That is why the photon matters. Not because it is mysterious, because it is exact. A light signal traces the surface of the light cone. A material observer remains inside it. That difference replaces your old picture of motion. Things are not simply moving through one shared time. They occupy different classes of path, and each class permits a different temporal structure. A time-like world line accumulates proper time. A light-like path does not. That is the replacement. You do not explain light by forcing it back into human duration. You explain human duration as one special case inside a larger geometry. You believe time is primary and motion happens within it. Physics says geometry is primary, and time is what certain paths preserve. Now consequence enters the room. The wall in front of you does not exist for you as matter alone. It exists as accessible structure. Light leaves the wall, or reflects from it. It reaches your eyes. It is processed, integrated, named. Your experience of presence depends on causal contact. And causal contact depends on light-like or time-like structure. That means the room feels immediate, not because immediacy is fundamental, but because local geometry permits stable interaction. Because once structure replaces intuition, the present stops looking like a cosmic fact. It becomes a local achievement, a local ordering of signals, memory, processing, and path-dependent time. You are not standing inside universal now. You are standing inside one coherent region of causal accessibility. It means what reaches you is not everything that exists. It means what feels simultaneous is not globally shared. It means the visible world is already filtered by finite signal speed and by the geometry that permits contact at all. And because light draws the limit, light defines the edge of your intuitive certainty. This is why the architecture behind Einstein keeps widening. Not dramatically, just enough. Columns separate by amounts too small to count as fantasy. Edges hold, but their relations shift. Depth is no longer assumed. It is established by where signals can go and how observers move. That is what replacement looks like. Not emotional collapse. Formal discipline. The old language said light travels through time like everything else. The replacement says massive bodies age along time-like paths while light traces null structure that orders causality without accumulating duration. The old language said the present is what exists now. The replacement says each observer constructs local temporal order within a spacetime that does not supply one universal slice. The old language said reality unfolds the same way for all. The replacement says agreement survives only at the level of invariant relation. Interval, causal class, light cone. That sounds colder than intuition, but it is cleaner. And once you accept it, a consequence appears. Identity is no longer anchored to a moving present. It is anchored to a path. Your memories, your anticipation, your sequence of thought, all belong to the kind of world line a human body can occupy. That does not make them unreal. It places them. It means your sense of becoming may describe how one class of observer moves through structure, not how reality itself must be organized in total. You believe your inner sequence reveals the world's sequence. Physics says your inner sequence may be local evidence. Now, the replacement is complete. Because once geometry takes over, the photon stops being the exception. It becomes the clue. The clue that causality, visibility, duration, and presence were never independent pieces. They were one structure all along. And you were just feeling the time-like part of it. If what destabilizes you is not speed, then what is it? It is not that light moves so fast that time somehow fails to keep up. That picture is still too human. It still imagines time as a universal medium. It still imagines motion as something placed inside it. But that is the intuition that is already collapsed. What destabilizes you is not velocity alone. It is the discovery that time was never the background everything shared equally. It is a local result, a measured quantity, a property of certain paths through space-time. And once that becomes clear, the problem changes. The photon stops looking like an exotic object at the edge of reality. It starts looking like the cleanest exposure of the structure underneath it. Because the shock was never that light avoids time. The shock is that time belongs to geometry. And geometry does not care what feels obvious to a creature built from sequence. That is why the present starts to weaken here. Not emotionally, formally. You were never destabilized by a fast-moving particle. You were destabilized by the possibility that your most trusted category, the category of now, was never fundamental at all. You believe now is the stage on which reality appears. Physics says now may be only the local ordering available to your kind of path. That is the pivot. Because once the question changes, so does the threat. The threat is no longer that physics has found one strange exception. The threat is that your entire sense of temporal security was built on a provincial case, a human one, a time-like one. And if the visible universe reaches you through null structure, while your mind assembles continuity through time-like structure, then the fracture is not between you and some distant star. It is already inside the act of observation, inside the room, inside the moment you are calling present. Einstein does not need to speak here. The architecture behind him has already said enough. It is not broken, it has reclassified you. Now the structure has to be stated clearly, not as atmosphere, as a boundary. Established physics comes first. In relativity, space and time are not separate backgrounds. They form one structure, spacetime. What matters between events is not distance alone or duration alone, it is the interval. For massive observers, that interval can be time-like. A clock carried along that path measures proper time. That is what your body does. That is what any physical clock does when it moves below light speed. It traces a time-like world line and accumulates duration. Light does not. A light signal follows a light-like path. For that path, the space-time interval is 0. So the proper time is 0. That is the core mechanism, not metaphor, not mood, geometry. And that changes the model immediately, because once time becomes path-dependent, the old idea of one shared cosmic present cannot stay intact. Different observers do not just report the same world badly, they divide distant events differently. What counts as simultaneous for one observer may not count as simultaneous for another. That is not confusion, it is built into the structure. So when you say a photon left there and arrived here later, that sentence is only partially complete. Later according to which clock? Later within which frame? Along the light-like path itself, no proper time builds up. That is established physics. Now the interpretation. One way to read this structure is the block universe model. In that picture, space-time is not something that comes into existence one present moment at a time. It is a four-dimensional order of events and relations. Your sense of passage does not generate the structure, it moves within it. That interpretation fits the logic well. If different observers slice space-time differently, and no universal now is supplied, then reality begins to look less like a flowing stage and more like an ordered totality. But this matters. That is an interpretive model. It is not the same thing as the equations themselves. Relativity gives the geometry. It gives intervals, world lines, causal classes, and light cones. It does not force one final metaphysical picture of becoming. So the distinction must stay clean. Established physics. Light follows null structure and accumulates no proper time. Interpretive model. The block universe may be the most coherent way to understand what that means for temporal reality. Unresolved question. why does temporal passage feel real at all? That question does not disappear when the geometry becomes clear. It sharpens. Because once the structure is stated, you can no longer blame the illusion of flow on ignorance alone. You still have to explain why observers like us experience sequence so strongly. This is where entropy enters. Carefully. Entropy is not what makes a photon's proper time zero. That belongs to space-time geometry. But entropy may help explain why beings like us remember one direction and not the other. Why records accumulate toward what we call the future. Why causes leave traces. Why broken systems spread instead of spontaneously reassembling. Entropy helps explain temporal asymmetry in experienced reality. It does not create the null structure of light. These are neighboring ideas, not identical ones, and keeping them separate protects the mechanism. Because the central reveal here is not that time feels strange. It is that the formal structure of reality already denies your simplest model of time before psychology even begins. Then the observer enters, not as mysticism, not as a creator of the universe, only as a necessary part of the final question. Observation happens along time-like paths. Memory happens along time-like paths. Conscious sequencing happens in physical systems that age. So if you want to ask why the present feels like a moving edge, you eventually have to ask how observers embedded in spacetime construct temporal order from signals that include null structure. That does not make the observer fundamental to existence itself. It makes the observer unavoidable when the problem becomes experience. And now the reveal lands. The world you call immediate is assembled from two different conditions at once. Your body accumulates time. The signals disclosing the visible world follow paths that do not. You live on a time-like world line. You see through light-like structure. That combination is not decorative. It shapes everything. It means presence is local, not absolute. It means visibility is causal contact, not shared now. It means the room around you feels stable because geometry permits a workable ordering of signals, memory, and matter, not because reality itself comes labeled with present tense. You believe the now you feel is written into the world. Physics says the now you feel may be the local form taken by contact, memory, and path-dependent time. That is what changes. Reality becomes less like a stream, more like a structure through which different kinds of paths preserve different kinds of order. What remains unresolved is not the interval, not the light cone, not the null path. What remains unresolved is why a structure like this produces observers who do not merely register order, but live inside the sensation of passage. That question stays open, and it stays dangerous. Because once the geometry is clear, the moving present can no longer hide behind physics. Now bring it back to the room, not to theory, to the place where you are sitting. There is a screen in front of you. There is light leaving it. There is air between the screen and your eyes. There is a body receiving that light, processing it, and calling the result present. That is the structure you actually live inside. Your mind does not meet the world all at once. It receives signals. It orders them. It binds them into continuity. It turns causal contact into the feeling of now. But the physics underneath does not grant that feeling any universal status. It grants you intervals, world lines, light cones, finite signal speed. Everything else is built on top of that. So the realization is not that your perception is inaccurate. It is narrower, more difficult. Your perception may be accurate enough for survival, for action, for memory, for language. And still, the present it gives you may not exist as a global feature of reality. You believe you are inside now. Physics says you are inside a local ordering of signals in accumulated time. That difference is no longer abstract. It is happening every time you look across a room. Every visible surface reaches you through light-like structure. Every thought that receives it unfolds through time-like structure. You live in one kind of path. You see through another. That split is small enough to ignore in ordinary life. It is too deep to ignore once seen, because the room still feels immediate. Your hand still feels present. The face in front of you still seems to share the same moment. But the confidence behind that feeling has changed. The scene is coherent. That does not mean the coherence is fundamental. It may be local, constructed, stable, but not absolute. Pause. 3 seconds. What you call now may be the name a biological observer gives to a narrow band of causal accessibility. Pause. 5 seconds. And once that lands, the problem does not stay in distant stars or abstract equations. It enters the act of looking. It enters the act of waiting. It enters the act of saying, "This is happening now." Because from this point on, you can still use that sentence, but you cannot use it innocently. And the final disturbance is not about light alone. It is about information. If the universe allows information to connect distant events through null structure, while observers build reality through time-like sequence, then the deepest tension is no longer how photons travel. It is how observation acquires the feeling of passage at all. You believe information arrives inside time. Physics says information may define the causal structure from which your sense of time is built. That does not solve the problem. It moves it. Because if the present is not fundamental, then an observation is not simply a moment inside a flowing world. It may be a local event inside a structure that does not move. And if that is true, then the next question is unavoidable. Not whether time passes, but why a universe organized by relations, intervals, and signals produces observers who feel that something is always becoming. And why that feeling tracks memory, expectation, and record, instead of revealing any universal present written into reality itself directly.